I'm Mariko Silver. I'm the president and CEO of the Henry Luce Foundation, and I am honored to be sitting up here tonight with the Poet Laureate of the United States, Ada Limón. So I am going to tell you a little bit something about Ada, but when we talked on Zoom to prepare, you said to me, a bio tells us almost nothing about a person. So I will read your bio, but before I read your bio, I'm going to ask you to read a poem. And I'm going to ask you to read a poem because, as I admitted to you in the green room, actually I did not come of age as a poetry person. I am a late in life poetry person. And I'm a late in life poetry person in part because my introductions to poetry all felt a little shamey. So I had an amazing, she's still amazing, best friend in 5th and 6th grade who wrote all kinds of poetry, and she was like, you should write poetry. And I tried, and I was like, ugh, no, I should not write poetry. And I gave up. And then I got to college, and the intro class for English majors, which I did not end up being, was called Major British Poets. And it was like a weed-out class, yes, for like, and it was a class in which everybody, in order to say anything about poetry, had to make a lot of space for themselves, right? And so I survived that class, but I did not thrive in that class. And so I always felt like poetry was not for me. Until a friend of mine started sending me, for reasons that need not be explained, started sending me recordings of them reading poetry. And I was like, oh. That's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I know you've said that your poems are meant to be read out loud. So I'm going to start by asking you to read Calling Things What They Are.
I love that. Well, it is such a pleasure to be with you all. This is a poem about birds. And you'll note that anytime I say something is about something, it's not about that at all. But let's just say it starts with birds. It's a prose poem. There's no reason you need to know that, but, it reads a little faster than a lineated poem because it honors the sentence versus the line break. That's as crafty as I'll get tonight, I promise. Calling things what they are. I pass the feeder and yell, grackle party. And then an hour later, I yell, morning dove after party. I call the feeder the party, and the seed on the ground the after party. I'm getting so good at watching that I've even dug out the binoculars an old poet gave me back when I was young and heading to the Cape with so much future ahead of me, it was like my own ocean. Tufted titmouse, I yell, and Lucas laughs and says, thought so. But he's humoring me. He didn't think so at all. My father does the same thing, shouts out at the feeder announcing the party's attendees. He throws a whole peanut or two to the Stellar's jay who visits on a low oak branch in the morning. To think there was a time I thought birds were kind of boring. Brown bird, gray bird, black bird, blah, blah, blah bird. Then I started to learn their names by the ocean. And the person I was dating said, that's the problem with you, Limón. You're all fauna and no flora. And I began to learn the names of trees. I liked to call things what they are. Before, the only thing I was interested in was love, how it grips you, how it terrifies you, how it annihilates and resuscitates you. I didn't know then that it wasn't even love I was interested in, but my own suffering. I thought suffering kept things interesting. How funny that I called it love, and the whole time, it was pain. Thank you.
Before I steal your book. Yes. Thank you for reading that.
Oh, my pleasure.
So I feel a little intimidated to tell you why I chose that. I'll have a college flashback. But in part, I chose that because I wanted to hear you say grackle party. and to hear how you would read it. But I also chose it because for this community, I think we wrestle with those questions of love and suffering, but we wrestle with them from the side often. We think about what does it mean, or we're asked to think about what it means to be authentic, and we have so deeply embedded in ourselves the idea that suffering is what makes you authentic. But love and joy, as you write about in other poems, also can be the core of authenticity.
They can't live without one another. And I feel like sometimes we believe in showing our work. I was with another poet, and we were watching a crow chase a hawk away from its nest. And these two crows were just really going after this hawk. And you understood why, of course. But I looked up and I said, oh, he's really showing his work. And I kept thinking about that sometimes we feel like we need to do that as human beings. That we're not just showing up and we're not just doing the work, but we also have to show our work on top of everything else. And then it's not only the idea of suffering, but then also making room for the portrayal of suffering so that we don't feel guilty for our joys. And I think artists spend a lot of time wrestling with that.
You talked in another interview about wrestling yourself with the idea of, why do I get to do this? Why do I get to have this life? And yet what you do, I think, for your readers, at least some of them, is you help us to be more authentically human. We talked in the green room and on the Zoom about our kind of addiction to thinking, our collective addiction to thinking, and our fear of feeling. And I said I was surprised to hear you talk about feeling some numbness in the face of that. Because to my mind, to be a poet or an artist always looks from the outside like living as a raw nerve, which I think is part of the reason why I never felt like I could approach poetry, even as a reader, let alone as a writer, because I'm not ready to be a raw nerve. But you give us the gift of your insides as well as your insights.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very true that when we're working as artists, that there's a level in which you can't always be as receptive to the world as your art might want you to be. It would be untenable. It would be, you would just be sort of, you'd spend one day being that receptive to the world, and by the end of it, you would just be a blob of jello, crying and weeping, and there was that great acting teacher, William Esper, that talks about being an artist is like walking around where your skin is so sensitive that even the wind burns. And I think about that, and so for me, I have always, I've figured out ways to set boundaries for myself, to set things that, okay, how can I protect that self so that when I do go to the page, I can be the most vulnerable I want to be. And that is where the best boundary I have is the page itself. I get to create this safe and sacred space in which I get to walk in, and no one gets to say anything to me. And I don't get to have to feel anything except what I'm feeling. And creating that kind of vulnerability, or allowing for that vulnerability on the page, is also a way of setting it down. It's also a way of saying, okay, this is where this can live for a moment so that I can go do the things that I need to do, whether it's teach or be with students or put on a brave face despite the world's chaos. All of those things, even get groceries, who among us have been in a really difficult moment, have lost someone or gone through a heartbreak? I remember after my stepmother died and I was by her side, and I came back to Brooklyn, and I was just so amazed that life was continuing. I was like, how is it possible that everything's still continuing? And I remember the woman who worked at the deli down the street from me, and I went to every day, the same bodega, and she looked at me and she said, how are you? And I just started to cry. And I was like, right, that's what so many of us are feeling all the time. And I'm lucky that I have an art form where I can create a space to lay some of that down so that I can then fortify myself to go into the realities of the world.
So I promised I would read the bio. I'll read the short one. For those of you who don't know or haven't figured out yet, which I'm sure is no one, Ada Limón is the author of 6 books of poetry, including The Carrying, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry. Her most recent book of poetry, The Hurting Kind, was shortlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize. She is the 24th Poet Laureate of the United States, and recently, the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, otherwise known as the MacArthur Genius Grant, as I'm sure you all know. So you've told the story of hearing about winning the MacArthur Genius Grant. And I listened to you tell that story on Code Switch on the train on my way up here, and I just cried and cried. The guy next to me was like, jeez, lady, But I just cried, and hopefully quietly. I think it was the quiet car. I just cried and cried.
You didn't get scolded?
I didn't get scolded, no. So that would be a serious conductor of the train if he was like, pull it together, lady, it's the quiet car. I mean, it could happen. But if you don't mind, I want to ask you about what you shared in that interview. About your grandmother.
Yeah, that's so funny that you would bring this up, because I took this is one of her pieces, her necklaces, and it didn't have a pendant, or it didn't have a chain, and so then I got this chain, and I think I built this whole outfit around this necklace, which is why I have the blue shoes to match this necklace. My grandmother, who dear, wonderful woman, died on August 29th, and I was by her side. We had just left her, actually, but I had spent the last 4 days with her, she and my mom, and I, she was 98, and I just adored her, and she's one of my favorite people, the great matriarch of my life, and as I don't know if you guys are like this, and given what you guys do, probably so, I immediately go into planning mode and try to take the weight off my mom. So I was like, okay, let me get to see, let me call the mortuary, let me get the headstone, and this phone number kept calling me, and I swear I was like, oh, these headstone people are really trying to get a hold of me, and then. When here I was, just so ensconced in this grief, but also, just the weird business of death that seems more complicated than it should be. And then finally, I got this email from the MacArthur Foundation that said, actually, can you call us? We've been trying to get you to talk on the behalf of somebody else. And I was like, oh, okay. And I had this moment where I was like, my grandma just died, and I was like, you know what? I'm not going to let anyone not get a MacArthur, because I'm grieving, right? So I was okay, I'll call them back. And I'm in this, and they just said, actually, that was a ruse. We are calling to tell you that you have won the MacArthur Genius Grant. And here I was, just sort of in my sweatpants, making lists, what picture should go on the gravestone, fresh grief. And I just started weeping. And I kept thinking that, my grandparents didn't have anything. And they desperately wanted to leave something. And they always would talk about that. And in fact, they lost all of their, any money they had from the sale of their house, they lost in a saving and loan scandal. So they had nothing. And I kept thinking, oh my God, she just like went up there and made that happen. And I was just weeping. And they're still so connected for me, because I think about that power that she had and what those two things happening on the same day. I mean, if I'd answered the phone, they really would have happened on the same day. But I've always maintained that when we have a great loss from someone who's really, really dear to us, there's something else that opens up. And in this case, it was this. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And I asked you to share it, not just because it made me cry on the train, but because you've written about being raised as an atheist, and that you also, in your poetry, write about the wonder of the natural world, and in telling that story, you're also, it seems to me, reaching for something else.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about holding that tension.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because when I say I was raised an atheist, and I was, and I am, to me, that's not a door closed. And I think maybe a lot of people think that that is. But I have always maintained that I love mystery. And I love the not knowing and the unknowing. And that's what I love about poetry, is that it makes space for that. The things that we don't have answers for, that we don't know. And that, I think, we don't give enough power to. And I think that I can't say for certain why it was important for my parents to raise me in the way they did, but I think that they were suspicious of anything that claimed to give language to the great mysteries of the universe. And so I think that in my poetry, I've always been interested in leaning into the questions, into the wonders, and to the why, and loving those things, and being curious about them, and making room and holding space for worlds that I may not know. You know, it's interesting to talk about that as we go into, you know, Halloween and El Dia de los Muertos and Samhain, you know, all of these things that are where the scrim, you know, the veil is thin right now. And so to talk about, you know, those mysteries to me, it makes a lot of sense, you know, at this moment on this day.
Yeah, I want to ask you to read another poem.
Yeah.
Can you read the conditional for us from Bright Dead Things?
This is a poem that I think of as an apocalyptic love poem. I sort of stopped using the word apocalypse a while back, and you can probably guess why. I feel like we just like conjured it. Like we were sort of saying it too half-heartedly, like, oh yeah, the apocalypse. So now I'm like, I don't know if I want to say that anymore. But I do believe in love poems. And I think, yeah, I think that's all I'll say about this one. The conditional. Say tomorrow doesn't come. Say the moon becomes an icy pit. Say the sweet gum tree is petrified. Say the sun's a foul black tire fire. Say the owl's eyes are pinpricks. Say the raccoon's a hot tar stain. Say the shirt's plastic ditch litter. Say the kitchen's a cow's corpse. Say we never get to see it, bright future, stuck like a bum star, never coming close, never dazzling. Say we never meet her, never him. Say we spend our last moments staring at each other, hands knotted together, clutching the dog, watching the sky burn. Say it doesn't matter. Say that would be enough. Say you'd still want this, us alive, right here, feeling lucky.
Thank you. So I think one of the other things that actually kind of turned me off of poetry for the first half of my adult life, it would just make this into a therapy session for me. But
I'm here for it. I'm here for it. Bring it on. Do you want to lie down?
Maybe. Actually, I mean, one of my first thoughts in thinking about interviewing you was actually, I don't really want to sit in these chairs, these like big chairs, you know, and I want to have this conversation lying down in the grass, looking up at the stars, not the Klieg lights, though they're very nice. Look up at the stars, yes. Feeling the earth under my feet, because you write so much about that embodied experience of feeling and connecting it to that deeper experience of feeling in a way that I think a lot of us, maybe particularly those of us who live in cities, but perhaps all of us, don't get enough time to do, don't have enough experience with. And so I want to just thank you for bringing that forward. But back to me and my therapy.
Yes.
Which is that I think one of the reasons that I shied away from poetry, other than the weird college experience, was that uncertainty. I would read poems when they were assigned to me, and I would say, but what does it mean? Like, what am I supposed to get out of this? What is the piece of information? Like, what's the nugget? And my job as a reader is to like dig until I find like the hard nugget of truth that's in here. And so even though a little bit later in life I came back to poetry as an individual experience, I will admit that the thought of interviewing you up here on stage was like terrifying to me, except that you're such a lovely person and you made it super not terrifying. But because I was like, well, how am I going to ask her about these poems? I don't think I know what they mean, right? In many cases, probably in all the cases. But then I heard you talk about that not knowing, and that's what poetry brings. And then I was like, oh, I'm not doing it wrong. I'm doing it right. It's okay to not know. And I think for this room, I'm not going to say everybody, but there might be a lot of us who are raised up in that professional silo of feeling like we have to know. Or at least we have to know how to get to the answer, right? So maybe we would be able to say, I know I don't know the answer, but I would say, well, I know how to get there, right? Or I know how to figure it out. But what you issue in so many of your poems is an invitation to just being in the not knowing. And feeling in the not knowing, and actually learning in the not knowing, but not learning how to figure out the thing itself.
I mean, I think that's so important, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that's what turns so many people off to poetry, is that they do think that there's a code that we're hiding in there, that it's like what were those things you stare at and then the image comes, you know? And I feel like you have to really equate it more to music and let it wash over you, and to listen to it and let it move you. And instead of saying, oh, what does that mean? I'd much rather hear the question, how does that make you feel? And I think that we don't make room for that question as much in our life ever, because we have too much to do. So we're not allowed to feel. Or if we're scared, if we feel one thing, you know, you're going to pull that thread and we're all just going to unravel. And I think poetry allows you to feel, but also allows for a little safety in that feeling, because that little white space around it means I'm going to feel, but then I can also walk away from it. And then when I want to go back to it, I might want to feel that again, and I might want to know what that's about. But I can also close the book. But I think of it like music. You know, you don't listen to one song and think, well, I don't understand that, so I just hate music. You know, but you'd be surprised at how many people do that with poetry. And so for me, I'm always like, oh, I want to make sure that people know that someone will say, oh, you read this poem, And I know it was about your mom, but I started thinking about my mom, and I don't even remember the end of the poem, but then I was thinking about this, and I thought, and she was like, I'm so sorry, I didn't listen. And I said, are you kidding me? You had this whole experience where you thought about your mother and something that you hadn't thought about for years. And it brought you back to that place where you felt something in that connection that you had forgotten and had maybe even forgotten you'd recognized. That, to me, is so much more important than you going, oh, I listened to the last line of that poem. Because that's not what poetry is asking you to do. Poetry is asking you to feel. Thank you.
So with that, can I ask you to read another?
Yeah, of course.
The Endlessness.
This one's about my mother. My mother's an artist. She's a painter. And it's still to this day, as someone who's not, so you may not be poets, or maybe there's some of you that are poets in here, but I'm the sort of the person who language is my tool, and anytime I try to draw something, I'm like, how do people do that at all? At all. And I have this amazing mother who can just draw anything. And so this is sort of a poem about that, but also about how I see the world. The endlessness. At first, I was lonely, but then I was curious. The original fault was that I could not see the lines of things. My mother could. She could see shapes and lines and shadows, but all I could see was memory. What had been done to the object before it was placed on the coffee table or the nightstand. I could sense that it had a life underneath it. Because of this, I thought I was perhaps bad at seeing. Even color was not color, but a mood. The lamp was sullen, a candlestick brooding and rude with its old wax crumbling at its edges, not flame, not a promise of flame. How was I supposed to feel then about moving in the world? How could I touch anything or anyone without the weight of all of time shifting through us? I was not, or I did not think I was, making up stories. It was how the world was, or rather, it is how the world is. I've only now become better at pretending that there are edges, boundaries, that if I touch something, it can't always touch me back. Thank you.
So I told you that when I was preparing for this, reading a whole bunch of your poems all at once, in order to do it, I had to just sit on the floor. I found that if I sat at the desk or I sat in the living room chair or whatever, I couldn't organize myself for the experience, and so I sat on the floor. But when I read this poem, which you sent, I just lay down on the floor because I felt like I wanted to feel what was around me in a way that I had never invited myself to do before.
Oh, I love that.
So I just want to thank you.
Oh, I love that. I think that's so beautiful because I think we just don't notice things as much, you know? And I think it goes back to feeling, is that if we notice too much, it'll be too painful. But I think we forget that we can also notice beauty. You know, the great poet and a dear friend of mine, Ross Gay, he'd be up here talking about these plants. He'd be like, are these real plants? He'd spend the whole time trying to feel around if they are or not. Because he's a noticer, and he will notice wild things all the time. And I feel like that sometimes we don't allow ourselves to do that too, you know? We don't daydream anymore. We just have phones that tell us what to do and give us the headlines and all of those things. And I think that I remember very earnestly as a child having that moment of looking at things and imagining what they were feeling. And I didn't think I was imagining it. I was listening to what they were saying. And it felt like, oh, this was, the world was made up of these objects that held past. And I think of that still, that we move through life where we are the center of the story. And I think it's good for us sometimes to not see it that way.
And we get so accustomed to honing whatever way of knowing is comfortable for us. Yeah. And so much attachment to the idea that our way of knowing is the right way of knowing, or is the way of knowing.
Yes.
Because not knowing is really scary.
And it turns into the way of doing, right? It turns into our way of knowing is then our way of doing is, this is how this is done, this is, and it becomes a cycle in which there is no curiosity because it's fixed. And I understand, as someone who is both a poet and has type A tendencies, those things rarely go together. Very, very rarely. There's like 3 of us that exist. The other poets that are supposed to be on the stage, they're drunk somewhere. No, but it's true. We tend to be, as a group, we tend to not adhere to any kind of restrictions. And I am someone who likes to follow the rules, who likes to do something well, who likes, all those things. But I find that it does sometimes restrict me in my own imagination, in my own curiosity. Like, well, what are the things that I could do differently? What about if I let this go? What if I looked at this in a new way?
Well, and the looking or the listening, as you said, in the way that you did as a child, and reading this poem, I just thought about all of the ways in which we limit our ability to connect when we narrow our understanding of what is valid and valuable. And we narrow it to self-protect, but in fact, what it does is isolate us from each other.
It isolates us from each other, and it isolates us from being present. Because we always have a plan. We know what's next. We can sort of move mindlessly through the moment. But if we take something like a task of, this is just a short aside from today. I got here early. I had many, many emails, as many of you do. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to iron my dress. Take a little moment to iron it. And just the sound of the ironing board had so many memories. And I could think of my grandmother, and I remember she ironed napkins. I was like, I just would never do that now, I was like, and here I was ironing, just upstairs, and I'm thinking of my grandmother, and then I'm thinking about everything that's happening in the world. And in that moment, just allowing myself to be off the phone, to be present, I felt like all of life was happening to me. And I don't think we allow ourselves that moment that much. And I'll admit that after I hung up the dress and went back to emails, I was like, no, I need to write a poem. And I did. And I wrote a draft of a poem. Thank you. I would clap. My mother would clap with you. But it was something and it was just in that moment of being present, of being quiet, of just not numbing. Something came to me. And I think that I know, and I can't speak for you. I keep saying we. I'm very suspicious of the word we, and yet I mistakenly use it all the time. But I know that for me, I am not someone that allows myself to be receptive enough to those quiet moments.
So you mentioned planning. We made all kinds of plans for things we were going to talk about tonight, and we mostly didn't talk about them. We talked about other things, but I got the benefit of having the 2 conversations. And I know that there are many people in the room who have questions for you also. So I think now we'll open it up for people who have questions. I think there are mic runners around. As people are getting their questions ready, I am going to ask you, Ada, what question you have for us.
Oh. That's a great question. I think my question would be, what scares you the most about poetry? I'm always curious about that, because I think a lot of people have different experiences with it. And sometimes it's writing, and sometimes it's reading, and sometimes it's, but that's something that I'm always interested in.
So when you pose your question, you can choose or not to answer Ada's question. I can't really see. I don't know if anybody has. I'm also going to ask you to read a couple more poems before we close. Yes? Yes, she's coming.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Marcel, and I'm with the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation in the Bay Area, California. I'm wondering if your poems always mean something specific to you, or do you sometimes let them be music that you yourself don't understand?
Yeah, that's a great question. Could you hear it? Okay. So for me, you know, there's usually a meaning that is revealed to me. And I don't always know it when I go in. In fact, I usually don't when I start a poem. I think something is happening, and I enter it. But there are many times where I look at the poem after it's done, or after I feel like it's complete, at least in a first draft, and I think, oh, that's what it's telling me. But for the most part, I then revise towards that truth that I know. But I'm never upset when someone else has a different experience and says, this is this for me. I always think that's great, you know? Like, unless there's something that I feel like is a misread of my own life, then I'll maybe correct it. But other than that, I always feel like if anyone else has their own experience, I want them to have their own experience. Once I write it and send it out into the world, it's theirs too. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I see one in the middle and one in the back.
Hi, Joanne Kelly with Philanthropy, Colorado. What scared me in the past tense the most about poetry is when my daughter told me that she was not going to major in political science, but instead poetry. Creative writing with a concentration in poetry. Her brother chose computer science, but let me just say that my daughter actually makes more money than I do and has had a brilliant career. She's here in Boston staying with me, and at the age of 28 is into all kinds of interesting careers, Congress and early childhood advocacy in our field, which is so great. So what I want to ask is, why do people have that reaction? And two, what can the poets do to solve the pressing issues of our time that we all care about in this room: democracy, climate, gun violence, everything? I know that there's so much that the creative world does to grip our hearts, as we've heard. And I'm looking at you too, Mariko, at Bennington. You probably had a lot of people who majored in poetry, right? And I just think that we overlook the art of communicating, and as my daughter says, community is really what poetry is trying to express. I don't know where she got that, but just wondering what your thoughts are for our field in that regard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that, first of all, I do think people have that reaction. I know that my father was thrilled that I was not going to go to graduate school for theater, but then not so thrilled when I said, because I've chosen poetry. But, every day, he is so grateful that I did, and so am I. I think that one of the things that that poets can do, and I think maybe many artists can do this, is that we know we're not going to write that one poem that pays our rent. We know how to do many different things. we know how to hustle in different cultures, in different situations. You know, poets know that we are going to try to do what we can to make our art and create our art, and then we will also work in different realms. You know, I was a copy director for GQ. I was an events manager for Martha Stewart. I have done so many different things in my life, and if you talk to any poet, that is true. And so I find that a really interesting thing, is that I do think our skill is a little mercurial. We can be the geckos in the room. And so I think that's, you know, a skill that we have. And then in terms of what poetry can do, or what poets can help do, I think that we are always looking for answers, and we're always looking for clarity. And I think poetry gives room for an unknowing, and it gives room for grief. And I think that we don't have a lot of places where we get to just grieve. And we often are like, no, we need to move on to the answers, the solutions. And I think sometimes if we don't grieve before we do that, we haven't done the base work to actually move forward into any kind of plan, because we're not functioning yet, because we haven't grieved. And I find that very true in terms of societal issues. I think the other thing that we can do, and I think about all the incredible young poets that I know and work with, is that we are very good at building community and making room for others. And to making language feel less like an edict, less like a polemic, and more like a song. And I think when we're having, you know, in the middle of very troubled times, poetry makes the most sense. And I think when you can't read anything, in this past week I haven't read anything but Mahmoud Darwish and Yehuda Amichai, like over and over again. Like this is where I'm going, you know. And those things bring healing, those poems, and I think that we just don't make enough room for that. That moment of grief, that moment, we just move on to what's next, you know? And it allows us to sit with it, the mess of it. Yeah. I know it's not an easy answer, but I appreciate the question.
Can I ask you now to read The Origin Revisited?
Oh, yes.
And then we'll come to the question that was in the middle here.
This is a grief poem. This is a poem that I wrote for after visiting the Yak River Valley in the Kootenai National Forest that has been scheduled for a logging project called Black Ram. It's an ancient forest, and I was brought there by a writer, and he just asked me to come and visit. And he said, you know, if you get a poem out of it, whatever, maybe. And it was the first time I was ever really deep in grizzly bear country. I'm very scared of bears, so there was that. But this is the poem that came out of this. It was recently published in The Atlantic. The Origin Revisited. What is there to be done now but enter against abandonment, become a hollow sound in the halo of labyrinthine green, become a crossed out word on the back of someone's hand. Once all of this became all of this. One not yet golden western larch curves by a white pine curves by a western hemlock. No one here is heroic. To enter here is to enter magnitude, to feel an ecstatic somethingness, a nothingness of your own name. All words become wrong. A whole world exists without us, but who is us? Lichen, moss, grizzly scat, moose hoofprint, like two exclamation points by the drying frog pond. How do you know you're alive? What evidence will you leave? So many myths are unraveling. A yellow swallowtail glides by over the sinless creek bed. A storm wets the skin, and we are surprised. We have skin. Woods rose, white flowered rhododendron. Nothing here is unfinished. What it gave me? I saw a new tree emerge out of a ground made of ancient trees, on top of more ancient trees, on top of more ancient trees, on top of more ancient trees, and understood then that this was how the earth was made. Thank you. Thank you.
So not to be too on the nose, but to me that's an answer, though it perhaps wasn't intended as one, an answer to that question.
Yeah.
Because you see a whole landscape in your mind in a new way. It might change your attitude toward it, or it might change the way that you act, the actions that you take. But also, even if it aligns exactly with what the reader thought before about that landscape, it's an invitation to take a moment for that landscape, to take a moment for that place, and to think about maybe place differently, and the importance of those trees.
Yeah, and to revisit what is sacred. And it goes back to that naming from the first poem, right? That how do we call it? What do we name it? And I think poets are always interested in both the naming and then also the letting go of the name. That there are no words. You know, poets are we're always interested in making words powerful, but we are always surrendering to the fact that there are no words. And I think that is why there is white space around poems. We are made to exist in that silence. So we're giving room not just for the language, but the failure of language, not just for the noise, but the breath between the noise.
Thank you. Is there another question in the middle here?
Hi, my name is Wendy Castillo, and I'm with the Bridgespan Group. My question is about your K-12 education. What was that like, and what were ways that your art and poetry was cultivated, or the opposite, whatever happened? And how did that change when you got to higher education? And what recommendations do you have for funding or resources or changes that need to be made to cultivate poetry in the K-12 system?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think publishing and getting your poems out into the world is a very brave thing to do, and I highly recommend it. I always say that poems never get more edited than between the time you've sent them in and wake up the next morning aghast by the typos that have gone into the manuscript. So I think that for me, my first publication happened, I didn't publish it in graduate school. I was encouraged not to publish. I had a lot of old, beautiful mentors that were like, do not do that. And I'm so glad, because I look at the poems I was writing in graduate school, and I'm glad that you can't find them. Sometimes I look at them in the basement, and I'm just like, I'm so glad that only I know where you are. But I think that the way that I began to publish is actually finding editors that I loved, looking at the journals that I really respected. Of course, there's the big ones like The Atlantic and The New Yorker. Those are dream publications, and they're incredible editors. But the smaller journals, I would read them and do, oh, I love what this editor's doing. I love almost every poem of these, whether it's a magazine or an online journal. And that's where I would send out. I would sort of become loyal to places that I really thought were doing good work. I also paid really close attention, and this was important to me. It's much better now in the publishing world for poets, but at the time I was publishing, I paid very close attention to the people that would only publish people of color if they were talking about specific subjects. I knew there was a specific magazine that if you were a black man, you better be talking about Detroit and bullets. You know, God forbid you were talking about love. And I saw it and I was like, I will never send to them. So like how I said, become loyal to the ones that you would want to be published in, you also have to be like, these are not, this is not, I'm not gonna support this kind of siloing of my identity or my poems. And that was very important to me because I was coming up in a world where I had to make sure that I knew in my workshop that there were people who felt free to write whatever they wanted, and I knew that they didn't think I should feel free to write whatever I wanted. And so I had to own that power myself. And then I was able to write whatever I wanted, you know? And so I think that was a big part of it, establishing where I wanted to publish was looking at the editors that were allies on that journey, that were able to express and sing and celebrate the multitudes of voices in their multitudes of being on the page.
Was there an element of your question that was also about education, or is that just what I always hear? Because that's...
Yeah, oh, yeah, so I went to undergraduate at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I was a theater major. And then I took my first couple poetry classes there and fell madly in love with it and decided that that's what I wanted to do. And then I applied and got into NYU graduate school, and that's where I went to graduate school. And then from there, I just had many, many different jobs. But the nicest thing about poetry is that you're always reading. You know, I spend my time, someone saying, oh, have you heard of this Latin American poet? And I think, no, and then I fall in love with Alejandra Pizarnik, and then someone says, oh, have you ever heard of this? And then I'm like, oh, and then I fall in love with Czesław Miłosz. You know, like it's whoever, the great part of the education of a poet is that it never ends. Yeah. Thank you.
Take two more quickly, and then I'm going to ask you to read one more poem.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Sing us out the door.
Hi, my name is Toddy Cosper. I'm a part of the Henry Luce Foundation. I think your writing on grief is really profound, and it's also, you know, something that's very intimate, but collectively part of the human experience. And so I was wondering how you find like the power and the confidence to share your feelings about grief in the format that you do with the wide audience that you have.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sometimes I think, why did I do that? You know, I think that I write because I have to write. I mean, I was just saying earlier that today I feel so much better being with you all today because I've written a poem. I honestly, like, my heart is in a better space than it was, you know, before I wrote that poem. So I write out of necessity, and I will always do so. But the sharing part, the publishing part, is always the tricky thing. I wait for sometimes years before I publish a poem. Sometimes months. But I make sure that I feel really comfortable with the subject matter. The biggest thing I have to figure out is if I have an answer for a question that a stranger might ask about the poem, am I comfortable with having the conversation? And that's where I have to be before I publish it. That wasn't always the case, right? I mean, I published a lot and no one ever saw any of them, and that was fine. And now I tend to publish in larger places. They get shared. It's a different thing. And so I have to make sure that I'm very comfortable with what's in those poems before I put them into the world. And sometimes it does mean sitting on poems for a year. I also check with my beloveds to make sure that they're comfortable with any poems that mention them or their family before I do that, because the worst thing I could think of to do is to cause harm with a poem. But yeah, so I think it's a lot of waiting. It's a lot of waiting and not going immediately like, oh, I'm going to send this out, but instead thinking, oh, am I ready for this? Especially with the poems that are more, very much more personal. You know, I've had poems that I've written extensively about infertility, and I had to have an answer to not just the conversation, but I had to be willing to say to myself, we're not going to, like, I'm done with this. I am ready to be child-free and happy and live my life. And it wasn't until I could make that decision for myself that I could publish that whole book. And I'm very glad I did, because people would come up to me the very first time, which I did not know, and say, you know, oh, have you tried like going gluten-free? Or like, you know, and I was like, oh no, I've made a terrible mistake. And so then every time I read from that book, and I still do, I will say, just so you know, the speaker of the poem is happily child-free and does not need any advice about. But I had to feel that way. I had to put that distance so that I could, you know, create a boundary for myself and feel safe in those conversations. Yeah.
And I will say those poems in particular, I know so many women, so many, for whom those poems have been such a critical support. Thank you.
Thank you. It was one of those things when it was happening to me. Oh, not unlike death or something where you think, how come we're not talking about this all the time? You know, suddenly all these women would like pull me into a room and be like, you're going through this. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're all going through this. And yeah, it was a very cathartic moment. And to me, I'm really glad that work exists for the work it's doing beyond anything I could imagine.
It's an enormous gift.
Thank you.
I think we had one more question.
Okay, hi. I'm Christiane Clymer. I'm here with Philly Foundation. And my question was actually quite similar to the one that has just been answered. But when you were sharing kind of how the need to write a poem, it's a moment where you feel like you need to process or put something down so that you can keep moving on. It made me think about how people use journaling. And I was wondering if you journal or if you don't have the need for that. And the second part of my question was like how much of a desire you have to then share things back out into the world, which it sounds like it's not necessarily the main aim when you're writing. But I was just curious. You know, sometimes people say, I'm a terrible sleeper, so sometimes people say, write a list before you go to bed so that you can fall asleep. And that, for me, was a way for me to sort of understand what you're saying. Like, when a poem comes to you, you need to put it to process so you can carry on. So, I don't know, I guess just curious about the journaling piece.
No, I love that. I love that question. And I will say that when I wrote it, I immediately sent it to two people. My stepdad and my mom. They share the same email account. I can't talk about it. And I don't know which one of them is writing me back because they're so similar. They've just started signing. Like they'll say, okay, M. But it was so, like, it was important for me to share it on that level. And then I shared it with a friend who's a poet. So it was like, so that's three people. I counted them as one. This is the problem with one email. And so I did share it, but intimately and in a very safe space. I wouldn't share it here, right? I do journal. I journal every day. And sometimes that journal looks like lists of things to do. You know, it's like meditate, check, you know. Which is a weird thing, like the fact that, you know, I don't think that that's what they had in mind, right? You know, meditate, check. Be healthy, check. But a lot of it is like ideas for, you know, and something I wrote in my journal 3 days ago is the last line of the poem I wrote today. So that's how they always sort of work together. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I ask you to read us instructions on not giving up?
Yes. I like reading a spring poem in the fall. Instructions on not giving up. More than the fuchsia funnels breaking out of the crabapple tree, more than the neighbor's almost obscene display of cherry limbs shoving their cotton candy-colored blossoms to the slate sky of spring rains. It's the greening of the trees that really gets to me. When all the shock of white and taffy, the world's baubles and trinkets, leave the pavement strewn with the confetti of aftermath, the leaves come, patient, plodding, a green skin growing over whatever winter did to us, a return to the strange idea of continuous living. Despite the mess of us, the hurt, the empty. Fine then, I'll take it, the tree seems to say, a new slick leaf unfurling like a fist to an open palm. I'll take it all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariko. Thank you for sharing so much of yourself with us.